Is liberty dying where you live? Escape to Keene at freekeene.com.
Good afternoon. Please be seated.
Good afternoon.
Let me say, just before we get started, before Mr. Paul comes up here, that the only person who is authorized to take any photographs or audio or video recording is Mr. Freeman, because he sought advance court permission to do so. Anyone else who uses any device to take a picture or make a recording, that device will be seized by the court, and we'll have it further. If anyone has a problem with it, I suggest that you not use it, because the court rules are very clear, and only Mr. Freeman has permission. If you use it and it's observed, it will be seized, and we'll deal with it later.
Right.
Yes.
Excuse me, can we see a copy of those rules and know who made them and what the motivation?
Okay. I'm sorry?
I was just
They're
wondering-
available on the court's website.
They're right on the board downstairs.
Sir, I don't have access to the court's website because my device was confiscated. I was going to live tweet this event. I wasn't going to take photos or video, but my device was confiscated. Could I get that?
Okay.
Sorry, I don't.
The device that was confiscated by your men downstairs, yes, it had a camera. I wasn't intending on using that. I was hopefully going to do a live tweet, but I'm prohibited from doing that.
So you're not going to record, you're just going to tweet while proceedings are going on?
Indeed. And I think other people would like that opportunity as well.
If you have your device with you,
They've been confiscated.
okay, so then I'm not going to delay the proceedings. We're here for a sentencing hearing for Mr. Paul. We're going to proceed with the sentencing hearing for Mr. Paul.
But you'll allow it if we get our devices?
That's the last, I'm sorry?
You'll allow it if we get our devices?
Yeah, usually I'll hold it in
Are
my
these,
hand.
again, I've stated my ruling on this. The
On
only
camera,
person who
yes.
sought advance permission, I'm not going to have further conversation. We're going to proceed with the Paul hearing. If Mr. Freeman sought advance court permission and he followed the court rules for doing so.
I'm asking about tweeting.
Okay, that's the last interruption I'm going to tolerate in the course. The next person who speaks, who is not either counsel or Mr. Paul, is going to be removed from the courtroom. I've made my ruling clear. The rules are available on the court's website. If in the future you want to address in a later proceeding how a device is used, it should be done by motion in advance of the hearing. It's scheduled for Mr. Paul's sentencing hearing today, and we'll proceed with that hearing. If I could have counsel identify themselves for the record.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. John Webb for the state.
Really Cossack for Mr. Paul.
Thank you. As I've said, we're here for the sentencing hearing of Mr. Paul today. And Mr. Paul, before we get started, I want to make sure, are you able to hear?
I don't have anything coming through here, and I will be speaking from notes, which are on this pad, and without hands, very difficult. Could we have these removed from our period here?
That's acceptable. If you could just remove those so that you can.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Absolutely.
Okay, somebody say something.
Okay, Mr. Paul, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, Attorney Webb, if we just state your name again, just so that everyone make sure that Mr. Paul can hear.
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. John Webb for the state.
And Mr. Paul, please, if at any point in the proceedings you have a difficult time hearing things, just raise your hand or do something so that I know it's essentially you're able to follow the proceedings. So just raise your hand or let Attorney Cossack know, and we'll stop and make sure you can hear.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Attorney Webb.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I approach?
Yes.
Your Honor, I've given you 5 sentencing sheets that contain the state's recommendations. One part of the first 3 sheets is blank, and I'll explain in a moment. The recommendation on the first 3 charge ID numbers is essentially the same in each case. 1.5 to 3 at the New Hampshire State Prison stand committed. He has 51 days of pretrial confinement credit. The mandatory minimum fine that applies in his case is $500 plus penalty assessment. The standard conditions of completing any counseling and treatment and educational programs is directed by the Correctional Authority or PPO, and that he remain of good behavior and comply with all terms of the sentence. And then in the other section, you'll see I've got a provision that allows him to petition to suspend part of the minimum. It says after serving, and I've left a blank there, my recommendation is 416 days, which with his pretrial credit means after a year in prison. So after serving 416 days of his sentence and provided that he's remained of good behavior, defendant may petition to suspend the balance of his minimum sentence, provided also that the fine and penalty assessment and late payment fee have been paid in full before the petition to suspend is filed. The recommendation on the next 2 charges is identical and they're concurrent with that first one. The recommendation on the last 2 charges is 1.5 to 3 at the New Hampshire State Prison, all suspended for a period of 6 years on condition of his good behavior. That's consecutive to the first 3. There's a mandatory minimum fine in each case of $500 plus penalty assessment, and the other standard conditions that are checked off. And I can go into the rationale later if you like, or I can do it now.
I think now would be the
Okay, thank you. The defendant's record was taken into consideration. It is as follows. It's really not all that extensive, but it is as follows. Michigan, he has a couple of driving misdemeanors, fairly old convictions, 88 and 93, in the nature of suspended or revoked license. It looks like he only had to pay fines on those. And then he has a retail fraud, second-degree conviction in 90 in Michigan. Looks like he did only 4 days on that. In New Hampshire, he has possession of controlled drug, Class B misdemeanor. He got a fine in 2010, and another in 2010, possession of controlled drug. It appears he got 30 days suspended, and then he did 7 days in lieu of a fine. Also in 2010 in New Hampshire, obstructing government administration. His sentence was 180 days with 120 days suspended. And then also in 2010, a contempt conviction, criminal contempt, 180 days suspended. Part of the rationale for the state's recommendation was the fact that it appears that he has now done more time with his pretrial credit than he's ever served before. Assuming he got his good time on the obstructing charge, I would say he did 40 days on that, so he's been in 51 days now. The way this recommendation is structured, as I said, he has to do a year in the prison before he can petition to suspend the balance of his minimum. Why the prison sentence? It's 5 felonies on 4 different dates, and he elected to go to trial. That does not mean he gets punished for going to trial, but he does not get the benefit of the leniency that was offered pre-trial, which I think the defense is going to go into somewhat. So again, 5 felonies on 4 different dates. The state believes that the year in prison is adequate for specific and general deterrence. The fines are the minimum mandatory fines. Thank you, Your Honor.
Attorney Costa.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I approach?
Yes.
There's two sentencing sheets. And just before I get started, for the court's information, Mr. Paul's parents are here, Art and Shirley Paul, and they would like to speak when I finish.
Whenever you think it's appropriate.
Okay, thank you. The sentencing sheets I've given you, the first one, which involves some stand committed time, is charge ID number 659370C, which is the possession with intent to sell marijuana. The defense recommendation is 360 days in the House of Corrections, 270 days of that to be suspended, meaning 90 days to serve at the Cheshire County House of Corrections, $500 fine, which is the mandatory minimum fine for that charge. A recommendation for administrative home confinement if necessary. The other one encompasses the other remaining indictments. I put them on one sentencing sheet. We're asking for concurrent sentences that are concurrent with each other but consecutive if imposed to the stand committed time, which is 2 to 4 years, all suspended for 5 years, condition of good behavior. Again, $500, the mandatory $500 fine, and those sentences to be concurrent with each other and consecutive with the 659370C if imposed. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And I will be giving the rationale from mine and Mr. Paul's view. I think Mr. Paul may address the court also at the end of the sentencing after his parents are finished. I'll tell you a little bit about Mr. Paul. I think his father is going to speak to his upbringing and his family life also, but I'll lay a small foundation for you. He grew up in Michigan. His father, Ara Paul, is Dean Emeritus of Pharmacy at the University of Michigan. Mr. Paul, Rich Paul, went to a community college in Ann Arbor, Michigan. He studied computer programming. He was very successful in his studies. He was hired out of school to work as a programmer. He's worked in the corporate world. He worked for IBM. He worked for Citibank. The most recent programming job was with a startup company in Florida. While he was in Florida, he reconnected with a woman who was basically his high school sweetheart. They'd known each other for years. Her name was Julie Taylor. They were together for a few years, and she was diagnosed with cervical cancer in 2001. Essentially, Mr. Paul became her caregiver for the length of her illness. In addition to being friends and lovers, they were both adherents to the tenets of AA. And one of the tenets of AA is to not consume anything not prescribed by a doctor. During Ms. Taylor's illness, one of the things that somebody suggested that to alleviate her symptoms and alleviate the side effects of some of the medication she was being given, was to use medical marijuana, which of course is certainly not even something that was talked about back in 2001 or 2002 necessarily. She refused to use this because it would not be prescribed to her by a doctor. Mr. Paul watched her suffer and die, and it shaped his political views and his moral views on the use of marijuana. She died in 2002. Mr. Paul continued to work, although he was in a fairly deep depression at the time. And by 2009, was really unable to work because of his depression. One of the things that, again, knowing people through AA, he was afraid of taking depression medications because some of his friends who were prescribed depression medications had committed suicide while taking those medications. That frightened him. He became a recluse. The one medication he did take was, he took Ritalin, prescribed to him for his attention deficit disorder. But he also began using marijuana to self-medicate at that time. And began advocating for the legalization of marijuana in general and for medical marijuana. This advocacy took on different levels. Civil disobedience, and Mr. Paul has testified at the legislature in New Hampshire, before the New Hampshire House of Representatives and the New Hampshire Senate, on the decriminalization bill, the industrial hemp bills, and the medical marijuana bills. The state argued in their closing argument, not today, that Mr. Paul is just a drug dealer. And I would say it's not quite as simple as that in this case. There were underlying things happening in this case which did not come out in trial. Phil Cristiano refused to answer some questions that I had asked him. He certainly did testify that he had offered Mr. Paul a deal of some sort, which Mr. Paul may or may not go into today, to resolve the issues of which he was potentially going to be charged. And I think some of those things are sometimes written off as conspiracy theories or paranoia about the government, but I think even considering recent reports of the government essentially spying on every American that has a Verizon cell phone, those things are maybe not always paranoia or conspiracy theories. And I suppose it depends on how one views these activities, whether one would view Mr. Cristiano or Mr. Paul as a hero or a villain, either way. Whatever their intents may have been. I want to speak a little bit about the goals of the drug laws and the intents of the law. I think there's no argument that the goals of the drug laws are to keep drug dealers off the streets and to keep illegal drugs off the streets. And I know that there is considered to be a necessary evil to use informants and to allow one person to go free to arrest somebody else, or several other people perhaps, in an investigation. But I would argue that in this case, this arrest and prosecution didn't do anything to interrupt the flow of marijuana or any other illegal drugs into the streets of Keene or the state of New Hampshire. It certainly wasn't the goal of this investigation to go up the supply chain to stop the flow of drugs into the city. As far as the goals of sentencing are concerned, I'll address each one in turn. I think the general deterrence of at least the sales of marijuana is questionable. As we speak today, the New Hampshire House and Senate are negotiating a compromise bill to make New Hampshire the 19th state to have medical marijuana be legal in the state. Marijuana is being decriminalized all over the country. It's legal and regulated in at least one state, in Colorado, where it's taxed and sold, much like alcohol and cigarettes. The superintendent of our own House of Corrections, Rick Van Wickler, testified in front of the legislature on the legalization bill to legalize marijuana. Not as an employee of the county, but as a member of law enforcement against prohibition. But as an official who deals daily with people that are incarcerated for use of drugs, possession of drugs, sale of drugs, it is his opinion that these kinds of laws don't work, either as a deterrent effect to prevent drug sales generally, or to stop people from using drugs. As far as specific deterrence is concerned, there were several videos shown in this in the course of the trial. There were all kinds of statements made during the videos. But one particular statement that I would point out to the court is that Mr. Paul told the confidential informant that he did not want him spreading the word that he was selling anything. The fewer people, the better that knew. I'd argue that Mr. Paul was not doing this as a business. This was not, he's not just a drug dealer in this matter. And I think he'll tell you himself that he will not ever sell illegal drugs again. That's not his goal. That was not his goal in doing this. He tried to prove a political point and reach a political goal. It didn't work out quite the way he hoped it would in having his trial. I told you a little about his education and his background, and I mean, he's not a person who was selling drugs because he had no options, no other skills to fall back on. And I suppose that's a double-edged sword, where you could say that someone that has those options and skills shouldn't be doing such a thing. But again, Mr. Paul has a political point of view about marijuana, and he was working towards a goal to prove that point, and that that was his intention with having this trial. I would argue that, as far as deterrence is concerned, that incarceration for long periods of time is not a specific or a general deterrent to the sale of marijuana. I can tell you from my caseload that there is no shortage of marijuana, people using it, selling it, possessing it. Putting people in jail does not seem to deter people from that. And I would also say that, especially in this case, the arbitrary nature of who to prosecute and who not to prosecute dilutes the deterrent effect of any kind of sentence of incarceration, where you have a person that was an admitted heroin dealer, that was basically his job to do that, walks out the door, and Mr. Paul is facing a long prison sentence, and is not a career drug dealer. And I think that's the crux of the sentencing, is that it just seems very arbitrary, especially, and Attorney Webb alluded that I was going to do this, and I am, and I normally don't do this in sentencing arguments, but the offer before the trial was no time and probation. And for the state to say that there's not a trial tax is disingenuous, I think. When before the trial was worth a no-time sentence, and after the trial it's worth 1.5 to 3 years in the prison. As far as rehabilitation is concerned, I don't know that incarceration is going to rehabilitate Mr. Paul from future crimes. I don't know that he needs rehabilitation from future crimes. Any incarcerated sentence in this matter would be purely punitive for Mr. Paul. I don't know, I guess there's an argument to be made that one can't be rehabilitated from a political and moral position, which is what this was about for him. Your Honor well knows, you sat through the trial, that it was about nullification in the end, and Mr. Paul rejected a no-time deal to follow through with his political point of view. And for those reasons, the sentence recommended by the defense, I think, meets all the goals of sentencing. As far as general and specific deterrence, we're not asking for nothing. He's willing to take his suspended time. He's willing to do the time he has and pay his fines. He's not. No one is saying that the act did not happen. It obviously did. I think it's more about what might happen afterwards. I think at this time, Mr. Paul's mother and father, I'd like to speak.
In whatever
Mr.
order
Paul.
you think it's appropriate.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, sir.
First of all, let me apologize to the court and everyone here. I have a hearing difficulty and I have not been able to follow the proceedings because of it. There are echoes. those of you that have hearing aids will understand, and those of you who don't, I hope you never have to suffer that problem. I'm here as Richard's father to ask this court to be as lenient as possible within the limits of New Hampshire law and the knowledge of the court with regard to what has occurred. Richard is not an evil person. He's a very good, honest, and caring young man. I would like to give you 3 examples of that, if I may. And if I'm repetitive, you'll understand because of the hearing problem.
Not a problem.
As a young child of, I think, 8 or 9, our family was visiting Mexico, and we were in Mexico City. Richard and his mother and I and his brother were walking down the street, and as is wont to happen in Mexico, there was a woman with a child sitting on the pavement with her hands held forward, saying nothing. And after we walked by, Richard asked his mother what was wrong with that person, and she explained that she was very poor and she was asking for support. Richard turned around and gave a few coins in his pocket to that lady. An example of his caring extends to when he was a student and working part-time as a taxi cab driver on the night shift. And he serendipitously went by a home in Ann Arbor, where we're from, and noticed a smoldering fire on a porch. He radioed the company for the fire department, went up to the porch, threw the burning wood into the lawn, and aroused the people. We didn't know about this until the fire department gave him a commendation for his actions. And the third, which has, I believe, scarred Richard, was after he became a very good, I'm told, computer programmer and moved to Florida with a small company called Masterlink, I'm sorry. He was reunited with his high school sweetheart. He was living in Tampa at the time, had taken a house that had been somewhat damaged, and with his own hands and with friends and with commercial work, had it upgraded, and it was a beautiful small home. My wife and I had the privilege of seeing it once. The company was really in Orlando, and he was telecommuting, but they asked him to please come to the home office. So he sold the house, and he and his sweetheart moved to Orlando, where she was then diagnosed with cervical cancer. Richard became her caregiver while he was working, expended all of his money, his savings, because the young lady had no health care, and she died within 9 months. Richard threw himself into his work intensively, and I believe never gave himself the opportunity to grieve appropriately. And he came to the conclusion after a while that he had to give up computer programming. He was director of the research effort there. And he came, because of his political views, in part, to New Hampshire. And there I'd like to talk a little bit about his political views. Richard and I do not share the same political views. We're respectful of each other. He probably more respectful of mine than I of his, to be honest. But we accommodate those differences. There is one thing politically, though, that we agree on and that is the legalization of marijuana in this country. I'm not going to grandstand about it. My background is in the biology and chemistry of natural products, and I've studied and taught in that field. And marijuana is not one of my specialties, but I'm aware of what goes on there. In my opinion, this can be handled in a much different way. We legalize alcohol, we control its use, we control the quality of the product. We know exactly through bonding of spirit manufacturers how it can be controlled. We can do the same with marijuana. It's quite possible. The government runs a plantation in Mississippi where they have various genetic strains of marijuana, knowing exactly what is in each. We can legalize a particular one. And I personally can see someday, not in my lifetime, but someday it probably will be. It's an emotional issue, and I'm not quite confident why that occurs. But at any rate, that would standardize, provide for quality, and certainly people will abuse it, just as they abuse alcohol. And others will use it, just as they use alcohol. I personally do not and would not use marijuana at this point in time with my knowledge about it. I might at some other point in time in life, perhaps. So I leave you with the thought that, again, I believe Richard is a worthwhile citizen of this country. I think he deserves as much consideration as is possible within the limits that are possible by this court and by Your Honor. And I hope that the almost 2 months that he's been incarcerated, I'm sure, have given him opportunity to rethink what he has done. And I hope that he has learned from this experience. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Paul.
If you have any questions, please feel free.
Hey, Dylan, thank you for your presentation. Now, do you need a moment? Do you want me to take a brief moment? Take your time. If you'd like me to take a break and give you a few minutes to compose yourself, I'm happy to do that as well.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll take a short recess, and then when you're ready to proceed, just let the court officer know, and then we'll proceed at that point.
Thank you.
All rise, please.
So should they be allowed to do? We didn't tell them that they wouldn't be able to.
There's a seat. As long as they're here before they start.
The only thing I can check on is media registration, and I file it as well. Yeah.
Shortly.
It's fixable,
Okay, good.
Memorial.
Are you feeling better now?
Yes, thank you.
If you want to begin again? Yes. Bob, Mrs. Paul says she's ready, so I'll just tell other people that are out there.
All right, please.
Thank you, please be seated.
Thank you, that was very helpful.
We need the monitor, we won't have a record.
There's no standing, so you'll have to go back out. No shade, John.
One side is cherry. One seat. One seat. Okay, thank you.
Ms. Paul, are you ready to proceed?
Yes. Thank you for the timeout. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay.
Mr. Paul, can you hear your mother? Yeah.
I just wanted to say briefly as his mom. Richard's one of the best people I know. He's not only good, but he's smart. He has a great sense of humor, and he stands up for what he believes in. He's also very determined, and he's determined to continue working for free choice and justice as outlined in the Constitution. And that's what brought him to New Hampshire. And time will tell if New Hampshire embodies all those qualities. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
And thank you for all the supporters who came.
Mr. Paul, I'd like to address the court.
Absolutely. Mr. Paul?
My name is Rich Paul. For the record, I assume everyone knows that. The first thing upon which I wanted to speak is there are two things that came up in the trial that made it look like I might have done something that was dishonorable as well as illegal. So I just wanted to address those two things. The first is, although I was contracted to deliver a quarter pound of marijuana, the weights reported by the analysts were something like 3.91 ounces. I don't know the exact numbers, but I just wanted to point out that in the marijuana business, when somebody talks about an ounce, what they expect is 28 metric grams. And when they talk about a quarter pound, they expect 112 metric grams, or 4 ounces. And so what was delivered was what the customer expected. Probably doesn't matter to you very much, but just to maintain my reputation.
You weren't shorting anybody.
Exactly, I did not defraud anyone. The second thing that I wanted to make, statement I wanted to make, is basically the same thing. I did not defraud anyone on the acid charge. And the prosecution presented an analogy. What if I had been selling marijuana, but I had only talked about weed? Could I then be convicted of selling purported marijuana? And I would argue that standing alone, that analogy is not apt. imagine this expansion of the analogy. I talked about weed and delivered at the end a bag of dandelions and crabgrass. It's weed in the bag. It might not be what the customer expected, but it is weed. By the same token, if I had been asked to sell acid and to deliver a bottle of vinegar, the customer might say, that's not what I wanted, but certainly I've delivered acid. Now in this case, we're talking about a street name of a drug. And to go into another street name, if you had purchased ecstasy in the 1960s, what would have been delivered to you was a drug called MDA. In the 1980s, MDMA was developed. So if you had purchased ecstasy, you would have received either MDA or MDMA, which are very similar drugs. MDMA is now archaic, but if you purchase ecstasy today, you might get MDA, technically, you might get MDMA, or you might get one of any of number of designer drugs which are one molecule, one atom off, or have one very small difference from MDMA, but yet would still be sold as ecstasy, because street names tend to track effect rather than chemical composition. Now there's a reason for this. People who sell illicit drugs do not have access to laboratories. So the way you determine what something is you take it and you see what it feels like, okay? If, to go back to now to acid, which was the word that I used to describe what is called purported LSD in my charge, in the 1950s, acid would have been unambiguously LSD. It was the only drug in its class. But by, I believe, the 1980s, they'd also found a drug called LSA in the seeds of morning glories. And that, too, could be called acid because it's almost identical in effect to that of LSD. In the year 2000, or sometime thereafter, many designer drugs sprang up, most of which start with 2C something. And as designation, is lab chemical designations. But all of these drugs, if they produce a strong hallucinogenic effect and are synthetic drugs as opposed to something like mushrooms or peyote, which are naturally occurring drugs, then any of those drugs could easily be called acid. And my personal belief is that although I have purchased and consumed acid many times since the year 2000, I don't believe, not many, but several times, probably three to five. My belief is that none of these drugs were actually LSD. There's no reason for somebody to be cooking LSD when there are legal alternatives like 2CI out there. And therefore, if the confidential informant had said to me, is this real LSD? I would have said, I have no idea. Even if my source had told me that it was LSD, my response would have been, well, the guy told me it was LSD, but who knows, you know? So that, my defense against that charge sounded absolutely absurd when it was defended by mere silence. So it sounded ridiculous. It sounded ridiculous to me without any background to put forward the defense that I put forward, just it hasn't been established unambiguously. Well, this is what I mean when I say it's ambiguous. And in the event, John Webb expressed some concern that this kind of narrow interpretation would render the purported laws unenforceable. This was in his objection to our motion to set aside the verdict. My answer to that would be, it's very easy for a confidential informant to say, is this real LSD? You know, with marijuana, there's no such need because you can look at marijuana and you know if it's real marijuana or not. And that's the last I have to say about the acid charge. Everything else refers only to the marijuana charges. if the state of New Hampshire had made a victim impact statement on this crime, obviously they did not, but it would have been a curious thing to behold. Let us assume that there were 10,000 pounds of marijuana in the state of New Hampshire when I bought the quarter pound that I passed on to Richie DuPont. After I bought that quarter pound, there were still 10,000 pounds of marijuana in the state of New Hampshire. And after I sold that marijuana to Richie DuPont, there were still 10,000 pounds of marijuana in New Hampshire. It's only when and if the FBI or the DTF chooses to destroy that marijuana that that number will change. So the impact there is very small. My attorney suggested that, well, Richie DuPont, had he been what I thought he was, might have passed this marijuana on to children. And let me say that I would feel terrible if I found out that marijuana had passed through my hands and been passed on to children who did not have a medical need. And if it was for a medical need, I would expect it to go through their parents. But there's no reason to believe that Richie DuPont had a greater chance of selling marijuana to children than the person from whom I bought the marijuana. So there, again, the impact is very small. The nature of the investigation to me was very important. I believe that the conduct of one person, everybody else was completely reasonable in doing their jobs. I may disagree with what their jobs are, but they did their jobs, and they did their jobs within the rules. But Phil Christiana was a man on a mission. He has investigated at least 3 Free Staters that I know of before he ever investigated me. And these were people who did not smoke marijuana, did not sell marijuana, were not involved in any way with the drug market. Most Free Staters are really straight arrows, believe it or not. We're economics geeks. We might smoke some weed, but we're not these big bad criminals. We're not even revolutionaries in the classic sense. We want to create a revolution of ideas. But normally the FBI is not on a mission to rid small towns in New Hampshire of small-time drug runners or even drug dealers. That's not generally the mission of the FBI. Phil Christiana's intent was to infiltrate the FSP, a political organization, and the Keene Activist Center, another political organization, by any means necessary. And in his zeal to do this, he stacked up a great many charges against me, 5, for the purpose, way more than you need to avoid an entrapment defense. And he did that, I believe, in order to terrify me into turning my back on everything that I believe, my friends, my politics, my beliefs, and that to me is reprehensible. I believe that the recent IRS scandal speaks to how the American people feel about targeting political activists for their political activism. But the IRS sought only to strip these groups of their tax-free status. Phil Christiana sought to strip me of my honor, my honesty, and failing that, he now seeks to strip me of my life using your court as a weapon. That, to me, is insane. We could have called, I wish we had called these witnesses, the 3 Free Staters that were investigated by Christiana before me, and he came to their homes and questioned them, were Russell Canning, Kurt Hoffman, and Dave Ridley. And they're all high-profile activists with no involvement in any kind of criminal activity apart from possibly trespassing in the course of their activism. And I believe that what happened is that Phil Christiana called up the DTF, and he claimed that they called him, but every member of the DTF contradicted this. I believe that he called up the DTF and said, hey, can you get me some dirt on a free stater? In the American system, I believe that that should be considered dirty pool. It's not law enforcement. It is suppression of political opponents of the administration. That's just wrong. And I think the fact that he did not answer straightforwardly the questions put to him on the stand indicate that he knew it was wrong. When first asked if he asked me to wear a wire, he said no. When asked again, he said maybe. When asked a third time, he said yes. Then when asked if he asked me to wear a wire into the Keene Activist Center, he said, I can't answer that. It's a matter of national security. This is not what I would expect from law enforcement. I am an anarchist, but yet I was flabbergasted to see it. And normally it's what I would, at least rhetorically, expect from government officials, but I was horrified to see what happened. And one of the reasons that I went to trial is because I thought that this malfeasance on the part of the FBI needed to be exposed. It needed to be exposed that the FBI was doing its best to crush political opposition and to infiltrate political opposition, and I believe that's what they did. The reason that I became an activist in the area of marijuana is an amalgam of things. First off, I spent 22 years going to Alcoholics Anonymous, and during that time I learned about codependency. And codependency is a disease suffered by people who love alcoholics, and they try to help these alcoholics through nagging, through hiding their supply, sometimes through physical violence, trying to do anything to prevent the alcoholic from using his drug of choice. The problem is that this is counterproductive. And in the program of Al-Anon, which is the companion program to Alcoholics Anonymous, it's recommended that people stop doing that and let the alcoholic get ready to recover in his own time. What I recognized is that the war on drugs is the pathology of codependency transformed into a national policy. It's taking a disease and making it law, where the law does exactly what the codependent does. It nags through public service announcements. It attempts violence against people who use drugs that it doesn't believe they should be using. It does all the things that codependents do, and it does nobody any good. That's where it started. Also, during this time, I would see kids get arrested. And, you know, these are mostly 18, 19, 20-year-old kids. And you'd see them, they'd get arrested, and they'd start going to meetings, you know? And they'd be these nice kids. They'd sober up, they'd be great, you'd have a good time with them, and then eventually their charges would catch up with them, and they'd go off to prison. And when they went to prison, they came back wrong. It was like they'd been, if you've read Stephen King, it was like they'd been buried in a pet cemetery. They came back wrong, and it was very difficult for us to help these kids. When they'd been to prison, they'd been victims of violence. In many cases, they've been sexually assaulted in prison. It's very difficult to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And I wanted to tell these kids that you have to stand up against the system, but the thing is, it would have destroyed them to do it. It was the best thing for society for somebody to stand up and say, this is wrong, but it was the wrong thing for them. I couldn't advise somebody else to do that, because it puts that activist at tremendous risk. And then there was Julie. Julie was diagnosed, she was in London when she was first diagnosed with cervical cancer. And she said, I have no interest in having children. Let's do a hysterectomy. Well, in England, the government makes your medical decisions for you. And they said, oh, no, no, no. You're too young for a hysterectomy, so we're gonna scrape the precancerous cells off, patch you on your head, and send you on your way. Then, in America, it was recommended that she take medical marijuana. And that was not available to her because of the law. Also, one of my father's colleagues recommended a drug called an anti-angiogenic. It prevents the formation of new blood vessels, which are only needed in an adult when you're growing a tumor. Well, what the doctors said to me is that, well, it would take 6 months to get permission for her to take this drug, and by that time she'll be dead. So it's better if she just die than break the rules. That's wrong. It's wrong. Excuse me. Marijuana, we don't know very much about marijuana because research upon it is forbidden. But we do know some things. It's a tremendous anti-nausea aid. And when you're starving to death because you're undergoing chemotherapy, an anti-nausea aid is very important. Julie paid $700, or I paid $700 a month for Julie's patented anti-nausea aid. It's been shown to shrink tumors by the smoking. It's been shown that although the smoke contains more carcinogens than tobacco smoke, people who smoke it have a lower incidence of cancer, okay? Which implies that if somebody ate it, it would have tremendous anti-cancer properties. That hasn't been researched because it's against the law. So what I tell people that Julie died of, in short, is precancerous cells complicated by government interference. As to my future, there's been some talk of rehabilitation. The easiest way to rehabilitate me is simply for me to cross a state line into a state where I can take medical marijuana for my depression. At that point, I am no longer of any risk to society. My word means very much to me. I realize that in defending my honor in the very first part of this speech, that I put myself at great risk of the judge saying basically, who does this guy think he is? But I took that risk because my honor and my honesty are very important to me and my reputation. So what I will do is I will stand here and give you my word of honor that I will not sell any mind-altering substance again in violation of New Hampshire law. That I absolutely will not do. I plan to head for Michigan or Colorado once I am free to do so, where I can, as I say, take medical marijuana and be about my business. And now that I have this possibly quixotic quest out of my system, I intend to go back to programming a computer because I was good at it, and I believe with the aid of medical marijuana that I can be good at it again. And I realize that I talked for a long time, and I thank you for your patience. That's all I've got.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Paul. Anything further from either counsel?
No.
No, thank you.
I'm going to take a few minutes and give this matter some consideration.
Thank you.
All rise.
How'd I do?
Good job, Rich.
Thanks.
Thanks, man.
I have no idea. Guys didn't even know that. Do you want him to wait here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if you heard, but Vermont just legalized, or decriminalized, rather.
All right.
Up to an ounce. Up to an ounce.
Sweet. Yeah, I don't have to go far, I guess, to avoid being a criminal.
Yep.
Just cross one state line.
Yeah, and Vermont has medical already.
Groovy.
And it's cheaper to register.
Groovy. Do you know if their medical allows depression or PTSD?
I don't know. I think it's pretty decent from what I've heard, but...
Because I'm pretty sure I could qualify for depression, PTSD, or social anxiety disorder.
Mm-hmm.
All from your experience in the court.
Oh.
It's like, whose line is it anyway? The points don't matter.
Judge Kissinger, just the same as the diplomat. Same last thing.
Hopefully different.
No.
Where's his, if not Denver?
No, I don't know. I just call him Judge Kissinger all the time. I really don't know what his first name is. I think it's John.
Whatever the number is, I can try to raise it. I might fail, but I'll try. So, even if it comes up with $25,000, which is pretty high, but for a year. I'll appeal, but if it goes with our request, I won't bother with appeal bond for 11 days. That would be a lot of fun. I mean, let's see what it comes up with. If it ends up being very little more than what we requested, then again, that may be the point. You have to pay $25,000 or put at risk $25,000 to avoid serving 30 days. Yeah, let's see what number he comes up with.
I'm sorry? How many years were you at University of Michigan?
Well, I'm still part-time, yeah, 57.
Wow.
I'm glad you said all those.
I went in
At first, I didn't even think like
56 years.
Long time.
It is.
Yeah.
all of it.
Well, there were,
I was visiting professors.
some of it was just stuff that had to be said. Somebody had to say it.
Nice,
It wasn't going to be those
relatively.
kids.
It used to be smaller. Every place is smaller. It's tree town, just as this area is. Not as hilly, but a few. It's kind of an oasis.
I've never had the opportunity to go to Michigan.
You didn't?
No, I haven't. No.
Well, you ought to. The Upper Peninsula, which is not economically depressed, is much more beautiful in terms of natural environment. But it's very lovely around us too.
Well, I went to, I have relatives that live in Winnipeg, Canada.
Oh, yes.
And I've gone up there a few times, but I've gone up to Canadian.
Oh, yes, okay, sure.
Oh, I understand that.
Wherever you are, you're just down
You're originally from New Hampshire?
Originally from Brooklyn, New York.
Brooklyn, I can hear it now. Yeah,
But I was just prior to becoming a teenager, we moved up here and I've been here ever since.
Okay, well, you still have a little bit of
Yeah, people tell me that.
just a little. But it's hard to distinguish as whether it's New England or it's Brooklyn.
Oh, yeah.
And where did your family move to? This area?
Don't let them tell you this is what trials are like. They're never like
Walpole.
this.
There's Walpole in every state in New England.
Seems like there is.
We have friends that live up in Alton Bay.
That's a pretty area.
It is pretty area. We'll go up tomorrow, probably visit them for a couple of days.
You're nicer than I am.
And you're Marshall?
No, just the bailiff.
Bailiff.
I don't generally expect a lady to get me a drink.
Just a bailiff or a big
Well,
Don't minimize it.
one of the few.
What won't happen, but what I will say is 99.9% of the day is
The acoustics here are so bad that I really are either the prosecutor or the defense attorney.
Well, this part was built in 1979 when it opened, so it was, I guess, 1978 and 79.
It's a bad choice, but what if I get through and I don't hurt you?
I don't think they thought as much about acoustics then as they do now.
And even with the microphone,
Is that against the
style,
It's a good turnout.
really couldn't distinguish much of anything makes sense.
I'm sorry if it makes me so much do it more often, but.
So I really don't.
Oh, are there more out?
Don't know what. Wait.
Yeah, that should be one of the nice things about the new court building is there should be more seats in
Four
the
grandchildren and
rooms.
5 grandchildren.
Oh, fantastic.
We gotta like speedier and more public trials, especially more public. You're dodging my question. No, I'm
As you well know, your kids make mistakes, but they do it. There comes a point where.
As you can always tell them you love them and
Oh, yes.
hope for the best.
Exactly, yeah. They both are sons. Our older son is very different. He's Michigan lacrosse. In fact,
You
they
can't have
just,
cell phones until
Big Ten
you
is
decide you
just
can, which is fair now, because if you have a phone taken from an enemy and said that you want them
they have other.
If I steal money from someone on the street and go.
Not enough Big Ten schools, and you have to have at least 6, so they added Johns Hopkins. And I said, how can that be? Well, lacrosse is the only Division I sport at Johns Hopkins, so the Big Ten made an exception for just that.
They've been very good over the years.
I feel I had to give it in case of my grass.
Rutgers is going to be in Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan.
Seems like a lot of schools.
I said, I'm just gonna have to, so they're gonna condemn my house,
Oh,
my grass, and
the Big
first time in my life, I've ever hated it.
You know, I don't know why they still call it the Big Ten.
Well, they did Big Ten and then some.
You don't think government exists, but government, you think.
You know what drives it is television money.
We have a right to steal from everybody else, and only then
Football games now start at 6 or 3:30 or 7:30.
He did a good job.
1:30, which is a decent hour. You had a game remote by then. Now sometimes they're going at midnight. But it is money. Drives it. Like everything else.
Especially nice for a defendant because you can sometimes hear the sidebars. Oh, yeah. You know, it's nice for us to at least know what's going on because it makes us more able to say, you know, if you hear.
Shout out.
Well, that's probably not I mean, if you hear the judge rule a particular exception, objection, you hear it.
Yeah.
That may then help you to suggest a question or a way around it based on the knowledge that the defendant has and counsel may not.
What I'm saying is that
To
I
me,
don't
it's
have to
important
say
that
this
the
is how it would work better.
defendant-
Just saying like,
I'm listening to you, I'm sorry. You keep saying there's alternatives and I'm not getting any.
Yeah. been able to bring about an
Not a
alternative.
collective group of individuals that say they're better than everybody else.
I'll say I don't have the knowledge to content to say how the world is exchanged. But I know I'm a lot better because human progress won't be quicker as the regulatory state.
I'm sorry, how many trials a week do you attend?
Well, not that, most things are done in, they're not jury trials. Some days we have 7 or 8 trials, and some days we only have 1 or 2. Because sometimes some of the investigators, prosecution, or even civil trials, or lawyers that, so there's a project that takes a full day. Sometimes it's maybe only an hour or 2, so they rely on that, and that's how they schedule it. And that's you know, some months we don't have any jury trials, the other months we have 3 or 4.
And you're with Superior Court, or?
Yes.
And how many just?
There's only one, so we have a marital referee. The only thing, they can make decisions, but it has to be approved by the judge. The judge reviews it and signs.
Did Christiana come after you? Okay, I wasn't 100% sure whether it was you or Russell Canning, so I'm glad it was.
Kissinger, like him?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And we do have a
I tell you, when I used to watch the X-Files, I had great respect for the FBI, but having seen them in action.
Part-time what court?
Probate.
Oh, probate, yeah, okay. So probate wills and trusts.
Trust and guardianships.
Okay.
You can only watch Animal Planet.
History Channel, Ron.
No, I never cared for history and this is yes, that's so demonstrably false. Okay, so well, looking at this guy, I didn't care for
Well, a big part of the way they present it in school is they do kind of the opposite of the History Channel. The History Channel has a tendency to sensationalize it a bit, but school desiccates. They take all of the controversy, all of the, you know, the fascinating interplays out of it, and you're left with names and dates that really don't mean anything, and you lose the flavor. Yeah. My favorite example is Helen Keller, and I disagree with Helen Keller's politics, but in school they'll say, you know, Helen Keller was blind, deaf, and dumb, but look at all that she did, and then they don't tell you what she did. Well, what she did is she was a very effective advocate for socialism, which I consider socialism to be a bad thing, but if you don't even say what she did, then what if you learn about
the flaws in this provision?
She did.
Service, how can it be any different for the provision? It's the same perverse incentive. So if you are diagnosed with certain cancers as a child, to live to 10 years old is $2 million. Okay, so if you're a child in the U.S. and you're not healthy, the government will pay that. So who else is going to pay that?
Well, it costs that because of government interference.
It's not, no, granted, that's a very strong point. So without that interference, let's say the price would be in half. It wouldn't be
When you look at like the 60s, 70s, there were even doctors that offered, you know, voluntary service.
Yeah, but the government pays for 3/4 of that. I hope he is. They said we have the right. That's what I just got. No, well, why are these issues? These medical advances are paid for by the government. They don't come about through schools.
Well, hopefully it works both ways. I haven't tried it, but I'm hoping that if you Google it'll come back legal as a national.
I don't know, I didn't try that either.
I think if there's a demand to solve a disease, I think it could be much more effectively prevented and solved through consensual interactions.
The research money for Viagra is twice as much as the research money for AIDS, because rich people use Viagra. Who cares? What do you mean there's these people that are dying?
But you're citing these numbers that are...
Why are we forced to pay for those things that we don't want?
You're paying for AIDS vaccine, or the attempt to make AIDS vaccine so poor babies don't die. I can't see a better thing to spend your money on. Oh, you don't? Nobody quite went for that. This company only supports life-saving medication. Decent speech?
I'm sorry?
Did I give a decent speech?
Richard, I couldn't hear it. So.
Oh, good Lord.
Sorry.
Well, it's on, I should have ordered a second one of these for you. It didn't even occur to me. But this will all be on YouTube. And hopefully the audio quality will be good. So,
okay, all I have to do is figure out how to use YouTube.
John will be able to find it, I'm sure. And I will ask Wendy to email a link to you, and you can pass on to John.
Like I saw one today.
Yeah.
Like 15 minutes.
I use computers, but not these social media.
Completely opposite.
I use email.
Greatest era of
Good way to keep in touch with family and
It
friends.
is. But the young people now use great nephews.
Like I said, it wouldn't, I mean, it's so highly.
They don't answer their phone. They don't check their voicemail.
All rise.
Thank you. Please be seated. Paul, if you would stand. So do want to make sure. First, let me start by thanking Mr. and Mrs. Paul for coming to New Hampshire today and for their remarks to the court. Particularly helpful to me what was the insights and comments that both Mr. and Mrs. Paul made regarding the character of their son, of the defendant in this case. Let me state from my perspective, and I'm sure we could have a long discussion about politics and issues involving the legalization of any substance. But from my perspective, this case is not about the politics of whether or not any substance should be deemed illegal, and that is a discussion really for a different time and in a different setting. The fact remains, Mr. Paul, that from my perspective, most critically, there were efforts on 4 separate occasions by you to sell marijuana in excess of an ounce, and that there was at least, you did sell what was represented to be acid. It's clear from the videos that we saw that this is not the first occasion in which you had sold illegal substances, but that in fact, from the videos that we saw, those illegal sales took place on a number of prior occasions. Every day in this court, I see the consequences of people who are addicted to illegal substances, and I see the consequences to both them, lives off track, people who had promising futures that because of their addiction and issues that come up with their addiction, and many of them, I think an overwhelming percentage of them start with using marijuana. And the fact is that the consequences of their illegal drug use not only hurt them, but hurt the lives of their families and innocent people who are victims of crimes that are perpetrated in an effort to secure those illegal substances. I cannot ignore the reality. This is not a case of just illegal use on your part, but also the fact that this involves illegal sales on, as I said, 4 separate occasions of those substances. Nonetheless, I do have to bear in mind sentences that are imposed in other cases, and frankly, the fact that though you have some instances on your prior record, it's not a huge record, and I do not believe that given that prior record and the circumstances here, that state prison is appropriate in this case. I think you mean what you say when you looked me in the eye a little while ago and told me that you will never again sell an illegal substance, and I'm going to take you at your word when you say that. Nonetheless, because the conduct, in my view, is serious conduct, and there needs to be accountability for the conduct, I am going to impose a 12-month sentence in the House of Corrections on the charge ID numbers 659-366C, 359-367C, and 359-68C. And I'm going to go along with the state's recommendation of a suspended state prison sentence for the two other charges. So, Mr. Paul, on charge ID number 659-366C, charging with sale of a controlled drug marijuana, a finding of guilty is entered on this felony. You're sentenced to the House of Correction for a period of 12 months. Your sentence to be served as follows: stand committed. You have pretrial confinement credit of 51 days. The court recommends to the County Correctional Authority drug and alcohol treatment and counseling. In addition, I am, although no one asked for this, I am going to place you on probation for a period of 3 years on the usual terms of probation and any special terms of probation determined by the probation parole officer. This will be effective upon your release. You'll be ordered to report immediately to the nearest probation parole field office. A violation of probation, conditional discharge, or terms of the sentence may result in revocation of probation or discharge and imposition of any sentence within the legal limits for the underlying offense. You're fined $500 plus a statutory penalty assessment of $120. You shall also pay the time payment fee of $25. The fine, penalty assessment, and any fees shall be paid through the Department of Corrections as directed by the probation parole officer. You're to participate meaningfully and complete any counseling, treatment, and educational programs as directed by the Correctional Authority or probation parole officer. You're ordered to be of good behavior and comply with all terms of this sentence. With respect to charge ID number 659-367C, the sentence is identical in all respects to the sentence that I just read, and it is to be served concurrent with that sentence. Again, you have pretrial confinement credit of 51 days on this sentence, and in all other respects, it's identical to the sentence that I just read, without the condition of probation, which will not apply to that sentence. With respect to charge ID number 659-368C, charging with sale of a substance represented to be LSD, again, this sentence is also identical to the sentences that I just read, and is to be served concurrently with those sentences. And you have pretrial confinement credit on this as well as of 51 days. And the other conditions all are identical with the exception of probation, which only applies to the first sentence. With respect to charge ID number 659-369C, charging with sale of the controlled drug marijuana, you're sentenced in New Hampshire State Prison for not more than 3 years, no less than 1.5 years. There is added to the minimum sentence a disciplinary period equal to 150 days for each year. The minimum term of the defendant's sentence to be prorated for any part of the year. All of the minimum sentence is suspended. All of the maximum sentence is suspended. Suspensions are conditioned upon good behavior and compliance with all terms of this order. Any suspended sentence may be imposed after a hearing brought by the state within 6 years of today's date. This sentence is consecutive to the sentences that I've just read, which are all concurrent with each other. In addition, you're fined $500 plus a statutory penalty assessment of $120. The fine, penalty assessment, and any fees shall be paid through the Department of Corrections. You're to participate meaningfully and complete any counseling, treatment, and educational programs as directed by the Correctional Authority or probation parole officer. You're ordered to be of good behavior and comply with all terms of this sentence. With respect to charge ID number 659-370C, a finding of guilty is entered. The sentence is identical to the sentence I just read. You're sentenced in the New Hampshire State Prison for not more than 3 years, no less than 1.5 years. There's added to the minimum sentence a disciplinary period equal to 150 days for each year. The minimum term of the defendant's sentence to be prorated for any part of the year. All the minimum sentence is suspended. All the maximum sentence is suspended. Suspensions are conditioned upon good behavior and compliance with all terms of this order. Any suspended sentence may be imposed after a hearing brought by the state within 6 years of today's date. This sentence is consecutive to the original set 3 sentences that I read and concurrent with each other. You're there a fine on this sentence as well, $500 plus a statutory penalty assessment of $120. The fine, penalty assessment, and any fee shall be paid through the Department of Corrections as directed by the probation parole officer. You're to participate meaningfully in completing any counseling, treatment, and educational programs as directed by the correctional authority or probation parole officer in order to be good behavior and comply with all terms of the sentence. Do you understand these sentences, sir?
I do.
Anything further from the state?
No, thank you, Your Honor.
Anything further from the defense?
Your Honor, I'd just like to address the issue of bail pending appeal. I understand that bail before was denied, but for the reasons expressed in this courtroom today, I think that Mr. Paul, there's been clear and convincing evidence presented that Mr. Paul is not a flight risk, nor is he a danger to society at this point. He intends to timely file an appeal. I intend to have the notice of appeal prepared and ready to go by the end of next week at the latest, and we would request bail pending appeal.
Response from the state?
The reason set forth in prior hearing is that,
The request for bail pending appeal is denied.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hearing is concluded.
All rise.
I don't either.
Do the right thing, John.
I'm not sure what happened.
Love you, Rich.
I'll talk to you.
Yeah.
No, we couldn't.
I'll be out to see you.
Take care, Rich.
See you soon, brother. Love you, man.
Don't give up the fight.
Folks, we have another hearing behind this.
Need to leave, folks? You have another hearing? I think he's the other hearing.
We'd like to invite you to visit freekeen.com. Freekeen.com features audio, video, and blogs chronicling the transition to a voluntary society. Freekeen.com also has comments and discussion forums so you can be heard. Freekeen.com.
I should be in Keene, New Hampshire with the Free Staters.